Hello, my friends. My name is Jessie, this is Penny, and this is Science Will Save the World. This week, we are building off what we talked about last week when we did flower anatomy, and we're going to move on to talk about how all those parts of a flower work and where seeds come from. Don't worry if you didn't watch the previous video yet, that's totally okay. I'm going to go kind of slow. I'll still talk about what all the parts are, but if you want a more in-depth explanation of the parts of a flower, look back at episode 5 on flower anatomy. Quick review of the parts of a flower. So if you remember, we talked about the parts of a flower as 4 whorls from outside to inside. So the very outermost layer is this green part, the sepals. Part 2, moving from outside to in, are the colorful petals. Part number 3 are going to be the male parts, these stamens, which is made up of an anther on top of a filament. And finally, the very inside part is the female part, this pistil, right? And it's made up of the stigma, style, ovary. Man, those are a lot of words to remember. Let me see if I can give you another way to think about it. Oh, hey, now I'm down here. I thought it might be a little easier to explain how pollination happens, not just with a picture, but with a model of a flower. And I thought it might be a little more memorable if I were to build the model of the flower on my head. So get ready for me to turn into a flower before your very eyes. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to work now from the inside to the outside, so the opposite of the way I talked about it before. And we're going to start with the very inside bit on this flower, which is the female part, right? Here we go. All right. Lovely. So now you can see I have a sticky stigma, a long style, and my head has become the ovary of the flower. So this all together is the pistil of the flower. Cool. And remember also that some flowers, we call them imperfect. They can have only a female part or only a male part. Other flowers we call perfect because they have both female and male parts. As you know, I'm perfect, so let's get some male parts up in here. You ready for it? Okay. Part number 2. That's right, it's happening. It's all happening. We have... Now I have for you the second whorl of my flower, which is the anther on top of a filament. And these together are called the stamens, right? So the male parts. These stamens also carry pollen. And so pollen is the male genetic material of a flower. So the male part has important information that it's going to combine with the female part of a flower in order to create seeds. And we're going to talk through that process in a second. But what you need to know right now is that the anther and the filament, so altogether these stamens, they're responsible for holding up the pollen. And that becomes very important. All right, so the next whorl out are these big, colorful petals. So we have, you ready for it? I'm so ready. I was born ready to become a flower. Oh my gosh, look at this. Look at me, I'm gorgeous. So the next whorl out is these big, colorful petals. So what's the purpose of a petal? You may have noticed that petals smell really good usually, and they're usually really brightly colored. Well, the purpose of that is to attract pollinators. And a pollinator just means any animal that will come in and spread this pollen around. Okay? And not every flower needs a pollinator, needs an animal pollinator to function. Some are fine without. But the ones that do, you'll often see their flowers being really colorful. Okay, one last whorl to go. This is ridiculous. I love it. Okay. Finally, we have, oh, they're falling apart, the sepals. So the last part of the flower is the sepals. And the sepals' job, as I think I talked about last week, is to protect the flower before it opens, like the green parts that protect a rosebud. Cool. So now I have my 4 whorls. I have the sepals, I have the petals, I have the stamens, and I have the pistil in the middle. All right. So what is pollination and how does it happen? Let me tell you. Pollination is simply the transfer of pollen from the male parts of a flower, the stamens, to the female parts of the flower, okay, resulting in fertilization. So this is very important. It's where seeds come from. Let's talk through a little bit of the mechanics of it. So when a lot of flowers need pollen to come from another flower of the same species and come onto their own sticky stigma. Okay, and so that's called cross-pollination. And when they require some kind of animal, that animal is called a pollinator. Some pollinators you may know include, I only have two of examples, include bees, right? That's a really common one. Another one is butterflies. That's a really good one. Other pollinators, however, are birds. Think about hummingbirds. They're very good pollinators. Bats are great pollinators. In fact, out here in the desert, bats pollinate agaves. They pollinate saguaro cacti, which is very cool. Also smaller things like beetles, wasps, ants can all do some pollinating. So very cool. There's a lot of different ways to do it. What we're going to talk about now, we'll just do a pretend pollinator. We'll choose the bee for now. Cool. So what happens is, I'm going to go through this whole demo. Get ready for it. What happens is a bee comes to visit a flower. And so what happens is there's another bit down in here that I didn't talk about, and it's called a nectary. And a nectary is like, it's like where the flower keeps its special Kool-Aid for the visiting pollinators. So it tricks them into coming in because it's like, hey, I made this sweet Kool-Aid. It's like a sugary, sweet substance. Come drink my Kool-Aid and then accidentally carry away my pollen. So the bee flies in and it gets down in here to get my nectary, to get my nectar out of my nectaries. And then it gets my pollen stuck on it. Okay, and then it flies off to the next Jessie flower. Meanwhile, another bee maybe will come in from another Jessie flower and it'll be like, yeah, time for Kool-Aid. And it lands but down in here. But as it does, now this other pollen will land, boop, on my sticky stigma. You see that? There it is. Which means this flower has been fertilized and now can make seeds. Cool? So bees and other pollinators transfer pollen from one flower to another flower by accident, and then they fertilize the flowers and let them make seeds. Cool. Before we get to that part, let's talk about what happens to a flower after it's been fertilized. So again, this process is called senescence, and that just means aging and sort of falling apart. Cool. So it's been fertilized. Hooray! Everything's wonderful. Do we need these sepals anymore? Not really. They were here to protect the bud flower before it opened. Flower's open. The show's over. Let's get out of here. They sort of fall off. Okay. Next up, we have these petals. What was the job of the petals? If you think about it, their job was to attract the pollinators to come in, right? Are they needed anymore? No, not anymore. So they sort of fall off. And maybe you've seen flowers like this where the petals start to wilt and fall off at a certain point. Yeah, that usually happens after they've been pollinated. Next up, these male parts. Do we need the stamens anymore? Do we need to have pollen anywhere anymore in order to give to more pollinators? No, this flower's already been pollinated. It's fine. That can get out of here. Okay, so what happens is this pollen grain up here that landed on the sticky stigma, it actually grows. It creates what we call a pollen tube, and it grows all the way down through the style and into the ovary. Okay, so now the pollen tube the pollen is somewhere inside of my head. Okay, it's in the ovary, and inside of the ovary, it combines with those special female cells called the ovules that were inside of the ovary. Do you remember that from when we talked about it last week? I drew them as little dots. So the pollen and the ovule get together, the male genetic material and the female genetic material get together, and they make what we call an embryo or a baby plant inside of the ovary. And so that embryo gets wrapped up inside of a seed coat, and it is now a seed. So this stigma and style are no longer needed. They sort of shrivel up and sometimes fall off. If you've ever seen like a tomato or something with that shrivelly little bit end on it, that was the remains of the stigma and the style. Cool? So then all that's left is this ovary of the plant, which then swells and swells and swells and has the seeds inside of it. And do you know what it becomes? Can you tell me? If you said fruit, you are correct. The ovary of the flower becomes a fruit. Any fruit, and botanically also a fruit, is anything that has seeds inside of it. So apples, fruit. Cucumbers, fruit. Oranges, fruit. Avocado, fruit. Also peppers, fruit. Tomato, fruit, right? So if you're not sure, just think about it and be like, are there seeds inside of this thing? If so, it is probably called a fruit, and also it probably is the ovary of that plant. Isn't that fascinating? And now you know where seeds come from. So if anyone tries to ask you if you've heard about the birds and the bees, the answer is now yes, because that's a pollination story. The very last thing I wanted to do with you today was to take you outside and look at some flowers that are blooming right now in Arizona. And we can just look real quick and see if we can identify any of the parts at a single glance, and also see if we can spot any pollinators. I encourage you to go out around your own neighborhood or backyard and see what flowers you can find, and keep your eyes open for pollinators there too. It's spring, so that means it's a really good time to spot them. So let's head outside and see what we can find. There's a bunch of butterflies in this little patch. And flies. Just look for insects. That's usually an easy one to spot. Oop, there's a bee. Doing its job. Notice how it's going from flower to flower. So by accident, it's spreading that pollen around. Hey, little bee. Here are more prickly pears, and look inside of this flower. There's bees down in there. And I don't think the one we saw in the other flower was a European honeybee. These are actually native desert bees, I think. Look at them in there, it's so big. They're just like swimming around in the stamens. Bye! Good luck! Look at all these flowers. This is a really good spot to look for pollinators. Although I should say, daisy-like flowers like these ones, it's really difficult to tell the flower parts. And that's because the middle parts here are actually it's not one single flower. Each one of these little things are each a teeny little flowerlet. So all the parts of a flower are way smaller than what we're used to seeing. That's why I didn't recommend you look at them or dissect them. They're really good to look for pollinators though. That is it for today, my friends. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you next time.